Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my show. This is Bernard Socks again. He's he's been feisty because there's no dreamies upstairs in my study, and he keeps shouting for them. You got too used to having dreamies here, didn't you? I thought today I would read you something new, something I've been writing. It's almost a whole manuscript length already. This year I began the year by writing something memoirish about the days when I used to teach creative writing, and my first university job lecturing when I was 27. And all those memories from 27 years ago, back in 1997, have been poured into this particular book where I fictionalize people and in order to tell the truth. This is the very beginning of the manuscript as it stands. Okay. I'm toying with the idea of calling this book about creative writing. If only they could write. Chapter 1. But you see, in the end, what my question really is, said the professor momentously, and everyone sat forward to hear what it was he had to say. Would a man like this really know what Zabaglione even is? Everyone sat back to absorb his words. Of course, so incisive, so brilliant. His question cut to the heart of the piece of writing in hand. We all looked from our professor to the author of the chapter in question, and we held our breath. The young bearded man, Mike, who used to be a computer engineer until he came to do this course, shrugged. Well, I don't really know. I guess he could do. The lanky professor hunched forward and winced slowly. Ah, well, you see, I'm not so sure. I mean, really. He spoke ruminatively, groaning with each word, as if he was straining to make himself understood, and every little effort made him ache inside. A man from his class and background? Really? Are you sure? Zabaglione? Mike stared down at his 10 precious pages of double-spaced manuscript, identical to the copies the rest of us were holding. He shrugged again. But then Fiona, who was forthright and wore her long blonde hair in a pigtail, burst forth. I agree with you, Anton, she told the professor. This kind of man would be more likely to reference some other kind of dessert, something more fitting to his station in life, something less exotic. Sponge pudding, perhaps. Spotted dick. Quite, murmured Anton Maudlin, our professor of deathless prose, on the world-famous course at this brutalist and modern university somewhere in Norfolk. Exactly, Fiona. And here he eyed Fiona appreciatively, while she preened for a second or two. It's a question of class, isn't it? And exactly how wide a young man's horizons might actually be. Could we really imagine a character like this, from nowhere, knowing hardly anything about the world, taking such a relish in a worldly dessert such as Zabaglione? This time the rest of the class, all 12 of them, were muttering in agreement. They had perceived the tide shifting in favour of the professor's words. They could all see that he was quite correct and that Mike had made an elementary mistake in his characterization. We all struck out the word Zabaglione in our copies of his chapter, or circled it. We all looked up at the professor, and some of us were smiling gratefully for his insight. Any other thoughts about Mike's piece? Anton asked gently, and then we all sat there in silence, turning pages and scanning lines, consulting the notes we'd made the night before class. No, there was nothing more to say. We sat in respectful silence for another 15 minutes as the classroom grew dark around us. It was tea time on Monday, near the beginning of autumn in 1997. We were only a few weeks into the first term for this new cohort on the novel writing course. They were still getting used to the routine, and so was I, as a new member of the lecturing faculty. I was about to take over teaching this workshop after our professor had spent a few crucial weeks with them. I was here to observe and maybe learn the ropes just for one session. I was gaining insight into how these things were done here at my new university. I felt very privileged to be allowed to sit and audit this session. 10 minutes more of utter silence passed in the room at the top of the English department. No, nothing more? Asked the professor gently. His eyes were a very pale and watery blue, his face a dark pink, like he was blushing all the time. He turned back to the top sheet of Mike's chapter and smiled at us all. That seems to be all. Very, very well done, Mike. Everyone, would you pass your annotated copies to Mike, please, and then he can read all of our editorial notes at his leisure. There was a flurry of paper-clipped copies suddenly winging their way to the grateful seeming Mike. It was only later that I realized that the notes passed back, sometimes anonymously, on these annotated copies could be extremely passively aggressive, malicious, and hideously wounding. Sometimes the real words bottled up by the workshoppers were given vent in these exchanges of scribbles. This was where the true critique went on. Well, that seems to conclude this evening's session, Professor Maudlin said with a rueful smile, glancing at his gold watch. Shall we stop here? I'm sure we all have trains and such to catch home. I was down the corridor, in my narrow book-lined office, packing my bag and getting ready to dash for the bus. The department had mostly emptied out by now, and they were about to lock up for the night. Mike came tapping at my door. Can I just ask, what did you think about the Zabaglione business? He looked as if he was wrestling with his conscience. His mind was being pulled all over the place. Our professor had really given him something to think about. I sat him down in the chair opposite my swivel chair, just a few weeks into my new job, and I was getting used to sitting people down in my office and talking to them like I was their medical doctor. I found that you had to have the same well-informed but conciliatory tone. Really, I think you can put the name of any kind of dessert in there at that point in your story. How do we know whether he'd know about Zabaglione or not? Only you do, because he's your character and it's your story. This is what I'd find myself saying again and again as I went on teaching these workshops and these courses, or variations thereof. Look, it's your story. Only you have the answer. Be confident about it. Mike still didn't look convinced. He was rubbing his beard and scratching at his hair. I think maybe I'm wrong, I was just thinking that maybe Anton was being a little bit prejudiced in the way he assumed a working-class fella wouldn't know what Zabaglione is. Then he looked worried. Is it bad of me to think that? I didn't know what to say to this, but yes, I thought, yes, you're exactly right. The professor is making assumptions based on class. Anton was extremely posh. He was so posh it looked as if it physically hurt him for screwing up all of his energy just to speak to us or to muster an opinion. And when he listened to me or any of his students, he looked as if he sympathized terribly with us. It must be awful for you, being you. His tender expression always read. Oh, fuck it anyway, Mike said. I guess I'll just change it to sponge pudding and custard, something suitably low class. Otherwise, he might mark me down if I don't listen to his feedback. Mike sighed and stood up. I better run. Thanks, Paul. Really, I told him, stick to your guns if you think Zabaglione is actually what your character would eat. I appreciate it, man, Mike said, leaving my office. But Anton's the professor, isn't he, yeah? It's his opinion that's the important one. That's all I'm thinking now. Then he brightened. Hey, a bunch of us are having a drink in the grad bar, if you fancy it. But I knew better than to drink with my students. They were all older than me, as it happened, but I knew better than to go drinking with those in my pedagogical care. I was being professional. I was their tutor. I went and caught the bus instead, back to my lonely, rented house in town. That's the very beginning of this. We go through the whole autumn term and a bit beyond, meeting all the characters on campus, all the admin staff, all the professors, and various students and tutors, and then the visiting writers, who are a class of characters, very famous characters of their own. Anyway, I just thought I'd give you a taste of something I've been writing. Okay, goodbye. I will see you again quite soon.